And yes, I'm very happy to have Robyn Teet with us today. So Robyn is a senior geotechnical engineer with Resolve Mining Solutions. And having been a geotech with over 12 years of experience in the mining industry, her appreciation and understanding of risk and working in a role that typically straddles safety and production, managing risk is something she works with daily. So today we'll be focusing on how sharing knowledge, understanding risk scenarios, and effective visualization of risk contributors can help everyone, not just geotechs. So this is going to be a really great session. We've got live polls. There's going to be lots happening. So I hope you all enjoy it. Please use the chat and we'll open up for discussions at the end. But yes, thank you so much, Robyn, for joining. It's amazing having you here today.
Thanks.
I was curious before we get stuck into your presentation, what got you into geotech in the first place?
It was actually an accident. So when I went through school, I had every intention of being a paramedic. No rocks involved whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I took geology as a fill-in subject, something I was interested in. I grew up on the Yorkshire coast in the UK. So fossils, rocks, all things cool geology. I grew up with. I had boxes and boxes of rocks everywhere. Mum still has some of those.
I love that.
And then, the interest really just started from there. I ended up going to uni, did a 3-year bachelor's in geology, and got really interested in the engineering geology side of things. And from there, kind of worked out that I could do engineering geology, geotech engineering, did my master's, and the rest is history.
I love that. That is amazing. It surprises me how many accidental geos and geotechs we have coming through. It seems to be a bit of a trend there, but it's good that you love where you've ended up. But yeah, so what have been some of the career highlights? I understand you've done a bit of work in some different places. So
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to work around the world. I've done, because I started off as a consultant, I did a lot of sort of site support type work, core logging, mapping. So I think still one of my most favorite jobs, I did some core logging up in Nunavut in Canada,
wow.
inside the Arctic Circle, had the whole Arctic experience, landing the plane on the ice, little snowmobile to get to the drill rig every day, and actually had my 21st birthday there as well. So
That's cool.
one of the most memorable ones I've had so far.
Oh, that's amazing. Wow, I've never been to the Arctic Circle yet. I'm getting closer every year, but I've never actually made it that far. So that's so cool that you've done that. Well, yeah, thank you so much again for joining us. If you want to fire up the presentation and we'll get stuck in. But yeah, so grateful that you've been here today. So thank you.
No problem. All right, I'll get started. Thanks, Jess, for having me again. Upfront apologies to the geos out there. Obviously, today's talk is not purely geology focused, but there is a fairly significant nod to what is happening in the geological world for later on in the presentation. As you've heard, I sort of drifted to the dark side that is geotech engineering pretty much from the start of my career. And what I want to talk to you guys about today is risk associated with geotech engineering and how we can share some of that risk across disciplines, and try and mitigate and reduce it through the typical project life cycle that we would see, from exploration all the way through to operations. But before I get into things, and Jess has sort of already alluded to this, there are polls through this to try and get a bit of dreaded audience participation. So I'd like to know from you guys what you think a geotech engineer actually is and what we do. There should be a poll popped up on your screen somewhere. Should be a fairly straightforward click for submit. And I will say my parents thought for a long time that I was an archaeologist, so we didn't quite get the message through for what I was doing with my life. I will also point out all of the options that are on the screen are things that I've been told that I do for a job. Things falling when they shouldn't. That's a pretty good summary. We do also pick up rocks occasionally. add to the rock collection, and there is also a lot of measuring things involved as well. So in a simple terms, yeah, that's pretty much what we do. The official definition as per AusIMM is that geotech engineers or engineering geologists investigate, design and monitor mining excavations. So there's your measuring things. We're also involved in the construction of waste dumps and stockpiles and the placement of backfill. So depending on what kind of mining method's being used, whether you're open pit, underground, there can be some other bits and pieces that come into the role as well. In addition, we do tend to get involved in quite a few risk assessments, rehab, particularly when things don't go as planned. And because we do work in that risk space, there's also a lot of communication across the business at multiple different levels, from operator all the way through to your senior leadership, management, executive team. And we do tend to get pulled into the weird jobs as well. So where there's a need for some out-of-the-box thinking, again, because we work across a couple of different disciplines and tend to be sort of risk-focused, yeah, we do get pulled into some very odd conversations every now and again. And as technology is developing and changing, which we would have all seen across what we do, it's more common that we get involved in some of those technology and innovation type projects, and also the implementation of new software as well. So that's what we do. So Jess has already highlighted a few of these things, but this is me. I'm a geotech. I've got around or just over 12 years experience now. Like I said, I originally studied geology, then made the switch to geotech engineering at Camborne School of Mines. I've had the opportunity, luckily, to work around the world. And it may not sound it, but I am actually Pommy, and moved to Australia back in 2012. So I've had a couple of site-based roles during my career, the most recent being North Parks and also out at Lake Cowell. But I have spent a lot of time in consulting, which has given me a really good broad understanding of a lot of different mining methods across multiple different companies, sizes, all that kind of thing. So I also wanted to give you a bit of an understanding or an opportunity to get where this presentation's come from. So geotech risk is something that has really grown in my sort of interest space, especially over the last 5 years. And a lot of it has come from being involved in a lot of those risk assessments. As I've progressed my role, you also get more responsibility, you get more involved with management plans, those kinds of things. But I am not a risk specialist. There are people out there whose job it is purely to manage risk and understand it. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really about, has really come about from my experiences and my observations through my career so far. You'll also see later on in the presentation that in parallel with understanding the risk, having a better understanding of data and how to use it effectively, particularly with that software technology development, sort of come hand in hand. So being able to close that loop out from just collecting data through to turning that into actual knowledge is something else that's been a focus in the last couple of years. So this is just a quick overview of what I am going to talk through today. You will see questions pop up. Some of them are polls, some of them are intended more to be rhetoric to get people thinking. And I really want to open everybody up and challenge some of the beliefs that I've come across that have kind of become embedded in the industry, specifically in the geotech risk space, that are not necessarily born out of reality, but have come from limitations of technology and, more often than not, dollars. A lot of the new technology, new ways of doing things cost more, so why spend more when we already have something that kind of half works? I will say there's my intention through this whole presentation is not to shame or blame anybody for any practices or anything that's been used on site, but really start that conversation around how to best manage risk through the project stage, from exploration and scoping all the way through to fees and then into operations. But before we start talking about risk, we need to really define what risk is. And this is something that anyone that's worked in this industry will have heard many a time. And there's also a couple of different variations on what risk actually is. So it can be applied from personal risk, environmental risk, social, reputational, financial, and pretty much everything in between. And the definition, like I said, can take a couple of different forms, but essentially the risk is the likelihood of a hazardous event occurring that may cause harm. So in the geotech space, obviously this harm can and has unfortunately in the past resulted in single or multiple fatalities. And what we do is we try to put controls in place to reduce the likelihood of these hazardous events occurring and therefore reduce the overall risk. So what I'm going to talk about next is legislation, primarily detailing New South Wales mining regs, but typically, although some of the terminology might vary between states and countries, the general consensus of what we're trying to achieve is the same. So we all have, anyone that's worked on a mining operation will know, the PCBU has a safety management system. So it's a key management process that everybody has to have. It is regulated, and it is in place to manage the health and safety of all workers, which includes your contractors and visitors. And everything that you can see on the screen that's in bold is related in some way to geotech, typically geotech data, but the geotech process as a whole. So you can see there's a number of principal mining hazards, which are shown in the green, that are linked to geotech, along with a lot of supporting documentation and processes that really have to come together and work together to be able to effectively manage risk. And one of the big ticket items that's been a hot topic in recent years is geotech competencies. And I know this has been prevalent in the geology space as well. So please stick with me because we are going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. But the crux of it is, without training competent people, how are we actually meeting the safety management system requirements? So like many other disciplines, there's been a significant reduction in the number of people leaving uni with mining geotech related qualifications. So what you can see on screen at the minute is a report or an extract from a report that the AusIMM completed back in 2021. It was their future workforce report. And essentially they identified geotechs along with some other disciplines as requiring urgent attention, particularly due to the low number of students that are enrolling in mining courses at uni. But also potentially more significantly, the non-specific pathways that have emerged recently to get people into the industry. So as we sort of already alluded to, I found geotech by accident. Jess has already said there's quite a few accidental geologists and geotechs around the place. So without having that direct pathway, it can become sort of an invisible discipline, and something that's very hard to promote down at the grassroots level. They estimated in the report that around 60% the report estimated that only around 60% of the demand across the mining engineering, metallurgy, and geotech engineering disciplines is being met at present, which was back in 2021, which obviously opens the site up to risk. If you haven't got your trained and competent people, how are you managing that risk, whether it be physical exposure to a hazard or financial risk, business risk, those kind of things. It's also important to note that in this work that was done by the AusIMM, geotech engineers are classed under the Australian New Zealand system as a subcategory of civil engineering. So much as the foundation knowledge for the two disciplines is similar, the applications of it are quite different. So in reality, the numbers that we're using to define how many geotechs we have working in the coal and metalliferous mines are probably overestimated. So all scenarios that we look at where we are looking at the number of competent and trained people are probably overestimated. So what you can see in the table is the results from the industry survey. So companies went away, they looked at how they think the demand for various roles is going to change over the coming years. And 85% of the people that responded actually believe that there'd be an increase in in demand for geotechs over the next 5 years. Obviously, this was back in 2021. And from what I've seen over the last 3 years, these predictions are definitely looking to be true. And my current role, I'm definitely seeing more of that too. There's more and more sites who are struggling to recruit into the geotech space. There's less and less of us available, and it's been critical for a while. So there's no sort of easy out for this. The other thing that this report, obviously being done in 2021, doesn't factor in is the impact that COVID had on the industry and how many people left the industry as a result. So I've had the opportunity to talk to quite a few different people and operations across Australia. This isn't something that's just specific to geotech, but there were a lot of people through a combination of border closures, reprioritising what they want in life, that kind of thing. So the people available on site to even train up any graduates that you do get have reduced. So before we even get to the data, we've obviously talked about people. One thing that has been flagged as a potential risk factor is the requirement for the geotech role on site to become a stat role defined in legislation, or a role that needs registration, which anyone that's familiar with the Canadian system, that's already in place there. And also in Queensland, there's the RPEQ system. So at present, geotechs aren't a stat ticket in either coal or metalliferous mines yet, but this is something that's been talked about. So back in 2019, the New South Wales Resources Regulator looked at, or asked for submissions from industry, basically, particularly focused around the geotech engineer in underground coal and whether that role should be a statutory position. There was some mixed feedback, but in general, there was support for the role being pushed up to that statutory position, but there was a whole heap of grey and fuzzy areas around what qualifications you'd need, particularly because of that pathway not being super clear. But again, that opens up businesses to more risk. So if we have a mandatory registration scheme, how are we going to get enough people into the industry that meet those requirements to then make sure that we're adequately managing our safety on site? So that in itself is a whole separate topic, which I'm not going to dive into. I'm sure there's plenty of material out there if anyone's interested, but it's definitely something to keep in mind next time you are sat in a risk assessment and you see trained and competent up in your risk assessment as a control, whether it be for geotech or for any other role. How are you actually defining trained and competent? Because anything that is in there as a specific control for a hazard should be measurable. So yeah, just one to keep in mind. So looping back to our safety management system, the system as a whole and the associated documents basically form the framework that demonstrate how you as a worker or your company more broadly manage the risk. So it in itself is a control for risk, albeit an administrative one. And within it, it details controls across multiple areas to manage the varying magnitudes and types of risk for any particular site. It should be site specific. It should not be a copy and paste generic, we did this once, so we'll do it again type system. And obviously with geotech being so embedded into this system, like we can see with everything in bold, there's already a risk that people making calls around geotech factors might not be trained and competent. Like we've just seen, there's a shortage of geotechs in the industry, there's no clear defined pathway, and the need for geotechs is increasing. So it's highly likely that this risk will transition into a business risk in the near future, if it's not there already, purely because of that limited number of truly trained and competent geotechs in the industry. But that aside, if everyone has a well-defined safety management system, the controls are outlined and documented, then in theory we should be smashing it. We should be have all our risks as low as reasonably practicable, and we should all be safe. But what we see is that, unfortunately, this isn't the case. We are still seeing fairly significant incidents across the industry, which to me shows that there's still work to be done. The example you can see at the minute, apologies for the super grainy picture, it's from an incident report from November in New South Wales. So this was an open pit mine. They had a rockfall from a bench a couple of benches up. Fairly large amount of material came down. This grader was actually working at the time, and there was an operator in that cab. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but in my opinion, it is purely luck that no one was hurt. There's no engineering controls in place. Even trying to argue that you've got FOPs on your grader, even year level 2 FOPs only rates you to about 200 kilos, drop from 6 meters height. And this rockfall came from 120-ish meters up. So even with the obvious things that we might flag as a control, we'll still potentially have people at risk. So, like I said, luckily no one was injured for this, but it does show that these kind of things still happen. And just to further illustrate this, there was a safety bulletin came out last June from the New South Wales regulator that was really focused on rockfall injuries that have happened in New South Wales underground metalliferous mines. It was primarily focused on development headings, which is obviously only a small portion of where you could be exposed to this kind of risk. And as we just saw, they obviously still occur in open pits too. But we're essentially not doing that great. So in that 12 months, we had, next slide. We had 5 incidents where rockfalls fell from development faces in the last 3 years and caused injury. One sent a worker to a hospital and he needed 25 stitches in his scalp. So fairly significant injury. There was another 13 incidents involving rocks falling from development faces. And it's not just New South Wales where we're seeing this either. The New South Wales report actually highlighted other mine jurisdictions in Australia have shown similar incidents. There was a fatality in South Australia, and I'm sure if you look at NIOSH over in the US and your Canadian provincial reports as well, it's something that's still occurring across the industry. So there is definitely still more to do. And my big takeaway from that report was this quote that you can see on the screen now. The regulator found that it's reasonably foreseeable that recurring rockfalls are caused by the inability to accurately predict geological conditions and rock damage caused by blasting. So they did make a couple of recommendations, one that was primarily focused around reviewing your risk assessments in that ground and strata discipline. And the second was around implementing engineering controls, including ground support for faces. So there's obviously some fairly obvious physical engineering controls that we can put in place, but their comment around things being predictable really started me thinking, are things unforeseen, or is there something else that's driving things being foreseen or not? So I wanted to ask the question to you guys. How many of you have been involved in a risk assessment where you've seen unforeseen ground conditions listed as a hazard? It's something that I've personally seen a fair bit, and it does lead me on to other questions, but I'm interested to see how many of you have seen that one pop up. Okay, so 71% have seen it, 29% haven't. So that's pretty much what I was expecting. It is something that I personally have seen in quite a few risk assessments, even recently. And it sort of led me to another question, which is really one for you guys to think about. It's not a poll. But how unforeseen is unforeseen? So rock is inherently heterogeneous. We all know this. There's very few examples of any homogeneous rock mass, particularly on the scale that we're looking at for mining. So with that heterogeneity comes a lot of variability. But typically what we do in projects, especially with geotech data, is scoping through to feasibility study. We do the drilling, we do the logging, we collect a whole heap of test data, we shove it all into a spreadsheet, and then we average it. So what we try and do is take an inherently variable rock mass and we average it. At best, we might do a worst case and a best case, but we basically simplify that whole variability down to 3 numbers. These then become your inputs for your numerical modelling, your ground support designs, if you've got crusher chambers, large excavations underground, if you're looking at what your potential for seismicity is, it's all typically based off averages and maybe a 20th and 80th percentile or something along those lines. So the inherently heterogeneous rock mass has been broken down based on lithology. We've already got rid of a few lithologies that we think are either too small to be included, or we don't think that they're going to be a problem based on whatever information we already have, or we don't have enough data to be able to do that statistical analysis. So something super complex has already been distilled down into something very simplified. So we've already opened up that window for things that are unforeseen because we've made assumptions before we've fully understood the risk scenario about what data is important and what's not. So there is a reasonable scope for there to be an element of unforeseen and unexpected parameters within any geotech domain, but by omitting lithologies, limiting your drilling or targeting your drilling and other data collection for things that you've got a preconception about, and undertaking your more advanced analysis based on those assumptions and omissions, we're testing hazard scenarios there that have an incomplete data set. So we don't have a full understanding of the rock mass, how it can behave, what it might do in terms of stability, and what we need to do to control that. So if we're developing and testing hazard scenarios based on incomplete data, what else are we not seeing in that system? How can we better capture data confidence in a way that's fairly uniform across the industry and clearly defined to everybody? And this is where I jump over to our geology friends, because you guys have actually already done a whole heap of work on this. So when you look at data quality and reliability, and then you move from inferred resource all the way through to a proven resource, that's essentially what you're doing. So you're increasing your data confidence and the reliability of that data through that process. So obviously resources are potentially valuable with reasonable prospects. Once you move across into reserves, you've got a known value. There's a legal element to declaring something as a reserve. There's also economic and technical feasibility around that resource being, that reserve being extracted as well. So the whole idea of the process that already exists in the geology space is that as you work through the different stages, each step forward indicates that you've got an increase in that geological knowledge of the deposit and then a reduction in the risk. May not be physical risk again, but it's the risk that that deposit is not what you said it was. So you achieve that reduction in risk by increasing your drilling, your assaying, your work alongside your JORC code, outlining your specific requirements. And because of that code, everyone is reporting in the same framework as well. So I know overseas different codes, but the same kind of thing exists pretty much everywhere. And the other thing in JORC that you would all know is that there are specific requirements about who is a competent person, so who can then declare the reserve and resources. And this is sort of, again, looping back to that geotech competency. it's a gap in the geotech space that's already been addressed in the geological space. So overall, the JORC process is standardized, provides companies and investors as well with levels of confidence in the data that's being put forward. And as I said, that risk that we spoke about competent people signing off on things that they're not actually competent for, is dealt with in terms of this framework. So as you move through the process, your geology knowledge and confidence increases, and your economic viability also increases. So if we move across to the project perspective, JORC does also provide some definitions across the various different tech study stages in terms of reporting. And there is mention in there of geotech, but it is very ambiguous, we'll say. You basically just have to state what assumptions you've made. So much as the process in geology has been fairly well established, in the geotech world, there has been efforts to do the same thing, but it hasn't been that well adopted. So what you can see on screen now is work that was completed back in 2005 as part of a large open pit project. So there was multiple companies, multiple authors involved, and it, excuse me, it was an industry sponsored and funded international project. So we're not just talking Australia here, we are talking global. And obviously it was focused on large open pits. But there were, out of this, there were numerous publications, lectures, webinars, those kind of things that really tried to put out to industry what the guidelines and recommendations were from that study. What you can see on the top of the screen is the recommendations in terms of geotechnical data confidence that came out of that study. But anybody that works in the geotech space would know very rarely do we actually hit those targets. So scoping study, for example, the intention is that you sit somewhere below 30%, purely because you don't have the data. And once you move through to feasibility and construction, you should be sitting somewhere around that 70 to 80% mark. But it's not used. It's not widely adopted. So does this mean that that approach isn't suitable, or that we need to look at a different way of incorporating data confidence into projects to then mitigate risk? So yeah, this was done back in 2005. It's now 2024. We're nearly 20 years on. We still don't have a JORC type framework that has to be implemented. So the other part to that is, do we need to look at the risk differently? Because of the limited requirements in JORC to evaluate geotechnical risk, a large portion of the risk tends to sit in the construction and operations phase. So there's enough work done during the projects to serve the current requirements, but there's a lot of changes made on the fly. There's a lot of things discovered, and there's a lot of risk, like I said, that sits in that operational space. So thinking at it from a budget point of view, you're shifting your risk from a capital cost to an operational cost. So your large scale work is completed, but yeah, your smaller scale, which is really going to have that hands-on influence on what happens day to day in an operation, isn't there yet. And it also means that personnel that are involved in the development, whether that be underground or in the open pit, are exposed to risks that potentially we could define better earlier on, and quantify more realistically early on, so that we can put controls in that are appropriate for that level of risk. The other thing I've also seen with this is even companies that do adopt this geotech confidence scale tend to tweak it and make it their own. So what you will typically see is junior companies with less money will drop those confidence values down as a function of the amount of drilling that they're actually capable of doing. So what I have looked at is, do we need to take a step back and think more broadly about our hazards and controls? The hierarchy of controls that we've all seen it, we all know it. Do we need to try and do geotech in the same kind of way? The intention being that we are closer at the base of the pyramid for more effective control, and moving further away from the point of the pyramid, the less effective controls. But a question I want to put to everybody, do we think that it's reasonable to eliminate geotech risk? Obviously, elimination being the primary goal for any kind of hazard management or risk management. Is it feasible to aim for elimination? Can we actually reach that? 86% no and 14% unsure. That's pretty well aligns with what my personal belief is, particularly in a practicable way. So if you've got unlimited budget, unlimited drilling, unlimited data collection, realistically, there's probably still going to be stuff we don't know about. And that's a function of the inherent variability that we have in rock. But what we can do is work to confirm some assumptions about the elements of the rock mass that we think are going to be critical for stability and overall performance, again, pit or underground, which then leads into whether your project's even economically viable, which in itself makes geotech risk a scale of problem. So our lowest level of control, so the pointy end of the pyramid, is your regional scale understanding of geotech and the geological environment as well. So if we take this approach to geotech hazard management, is it then reasonable to assume that the more we learn about the rock mass, its variability, the potential impact of that variability on the proposed mining excavations, less time spent on, or time and money spent on rehab, changing mine designs during development, and therefore the less unforeseen ground conditions we come across? So it's really switching from being a reactive approach where it's a lot of your risk is sat in that operational phase to a proactive approach where we're trying to better understand it at the project stage so that the appropriate controls are in place as we go. That also feeds into understanding more realistic hazard scenarios, which then again informs what controls, systems, processes, etc. need to be put in place. So we've already said that we want to look at geotech risk more aligned with the hierarchy of controls and project stage. But getting to the data end of things, we really need to understand where it's coming from and how that transition from data, numbers in a spreadsheet, whatever it looks like, through to actual knowledge is happening. This is another loop that I've seen poorly managed in general. Some sites do it better than others. And I've also fallen into the trap of myself. So not closing out to make sure that something that you know has then been transferred to something that everybody else knows. So when you think about the data, it can basically come from places. So you've got current drilling and data collection campaigns, and then there's corporate knowledge. So a lot of your corporate knowledge, goes all the way back to your original exploration days, which for some sites can be a very long time ago. So the chances of having somebody sat there in the corner that knows everything since day one are slim. So these two sources provide constant feedback into those risk scenarios and the corporate knowledge so that you're combining with data management and visualization to inform risk. Because at the end of the day, there's no point having data if you aren't able to visualize it and actually use it effectively. So I'll talk about these elements in the next couple of slides, but the key message really is that if data is not effectively utilized or the data collection hasn't focused on testing risk scenarios and it's just an average of an average of an average potentially, the confidence in understanding is still going to be limited, or even worse, potentially overestimated, which then you start getting into the territory of hidden risks. So integrated data management and monitoring systems. I'm going to start with this one and then move on to visualization. So with an increased amount of data, we also introduce another hazard. And again, it's something I've seen across sites from everybody from your small little junior companies all the way through to your top tiers. And I'm not going to poll for this one, but I do have a few questions for you all to think about. Who has drilling databases saved in a purpose-built database system? Because my pet peeve is that Excel is not a database. It is not easily searchable. It's not a database. And in addition to that, who has currently got or has been involved with production monitoring systems like PitRAM or AMPS or something along those lines? They're just two small components of where we can get data from that can help us inform geotech risk. And it's only a small portion of data that's collected during study to operational stages. So if we're not capturing the information in something that's readily accessible, something that's maintained, so you haven't got weird typos and everyone's tried to search for a lift code somewhere and someone's got letters backwards, or something that makes it hard to use, not only is our efficiency being slowed down because we're having to try and fix some of those errors or try and find data because of things like typos, but there's also a real hazard that we're introducing, that the incorrect data, outdated data, or information that's no longer relevant is being used, or it's not being used at all, because we all know if it's too hard, people won't do it. It's a function of humans, unfortunately, but it's something that we do need to consider. Something that's starting to phase out, but also still common, is paper records. So you can do the best maps, you can create the best logs in the world, but if you don't digitize them into some kind of software platform that's easily accessible, I would argue they are essentially useless, because they can't be easily accessed by everybody. The only time that they come into use, in New South Wales, it's a Section 155 notice, which is essentially when the regulator requests more information or you're subpoenaed from a lawyer after a major incident. So very rarely during operational use are paper records of any use, because they take time to find. You've got to sift through whichever random filing system somebody's used, go through your library, those kind of things. So they just don't get used, but lawyers love it because it normally proves a point. So there are commercial platforms out there that can be adopted to try and help people address some of these hazards that we're introducing with this data. And with specific focus on the geotech monitoring space, what I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides is very much focused on a package called MXWrap, which you guys may or may not have come across. I will point out it's not the only software package that can do what I'm showing you. It's just one that I'm most familiar with, and we've been able to implement it to try and mitigate some of these risks. One other risk factor to flag as well is that a lot of sites, because we don't have people, we have resource poor across disciplines, there's still a legacy where there were more people on site to be able to manage some of these risks and address some of these challenges with data. So I'm sure we've all been in roles, or may currently be in roles, where you are expected to do more with less, and you feel that stress, you feel the impact on your mental health, and you see the general decline in workplace happiness that comes with the do more with less approach. And often it can be dollars that stands in the way of a productive team and a happy team. And we all know that happy teams produce better quality results. Whereas a burnt out team, disengaged, you're looking for work elsewhere, you're not going to get your best quality, again, introducing more risk. We haven't even actually started looking at data yet. So it's also important to flag that dollars doesn't always mean salaries either. There's a lot of little things that can be done in the warm and fuzzy space to build team morale, keep engagement up, and support a really positive and healthy workplace culture. So I just wanted to flag that. But looking at what solutions are out there with data management and integration, like I said, MXWrap is a software platform I've had quite a lot to do with, but I'm not purely promoting them. So it's not about the who, so it's not about MXWrap, it's about what it can do. So it is a package that's developed by the Australian Centre of Geomechanics. Originally, it came from the seismic world. So supporting people in monitoring their seismic response to mining. But over the last 10 years, the platform's really expanded into a broader geotech monitoring platform. And it's got different apps, different capabilities that goes well beyond its initial intention. And there's what you can see on the top left of the screen is just a few of the things that it can do now. So it's become a tool that supports data management, data visualization. It's backed up, so you're not at risk of losing data. Depending how you've got it set up, it can be backed up on your internal network as well as through the ACG network. And it enables the user to basically change charts, 3D views, tables. You can add in user-defined calculations. So what you can see on the screen is examples from damage mapping, which is in the top right, cave monitoring data and visualization in the bottom right, an example of how the data from instrumentation can also be incorporated, which are the two charts that you can see in the middle. So there's nothing earth-shattering about any of these elements, really. But what is innovative with it is the ability to visualize the information in one program. So you're not pulling drill hole data from Acquire, monitoring data from an Excel spreadsheet, the typical ways that we have to deal with data. This is all in one spot. So this tool, particularly in the caving space, so the bottom right, this really changed things for me personally working as a geotech in a caving operation, because having that ability to visualize all your data in one spot sounds really simple, but it is so effective in being able to speed up analysis, better explain to management what's going on, highlight gaps in data, all those kind of things, which you would otherwise spend hours and hours trolling through data sets to try and pull together into something that makes some form of sense. And until recently, there's been very little systems integration in geotech. So like I said, you've got to juggle various different Excel spreadsheets. There's never enough monitors in the world to have everything open that you need to look at once. And much as independent suppliers of technology have developed front-end platforms for their particular technology, there's been very few spots where you can, irrespective of supplier, you can pull everything in. So obviously, as a data-driven role, particularly in the operations space, visualizing everything together is a huge help. Again, talking about caving, because our production rates are inherently linked to our air gap management, particularly in the early stages of cave development, and therefore where your cave back sits, this tool actually enabled us to more effectively manage air blast as a principal mining hazard, and do it more effectively so that, again, it's not taking a whole week to work out where something is. You can literally open the data all in one spot and see it. So I'm sure everybody can think of similar examples across the disciplines that you work in, where you are juggling multiple different data sets. So this particular software is now expanding out beyond geotech because it can be customized. So it forces you into maintaining data in common formats. Things are backed up, like I said, and the visual tools that you can access allow you to step through data to see not just changes in the data at one given point in time, but how that has changed over time as well. So it's really allowing you to visualize what your data was already trying to tell you, but you couldn't necessarily see. And another source of another source of knowledge that I've seen very much undervalued and sometimes forgotten is corporate knowledge. So this can be in the form of old reports, maps, old investigations, things like that, and also people. So I'm sure we can all relate to somebody that we know that's worked on a site that sort of just seems to be there forever. Probably going to be the last ones there when the lights need turning off at the end of the project. The information that they have just in their head is still super important, and things that need to be captured. So, and they don't need to be technical experts either. I've found a lot of value in operators that have been on sites for a long time. They may not understand the ins and outs of the technical aspects of what they're telling you, but I've worked with some jumbo operators that can tell me a lot more about the ground conditions than any kind of block model drilling would ever be able to tell me. So you'll see the poll on the screen again. Question time. How many of you, have worked on site where the old files are just shoved in some kind of archive box or some library that's hidden in a room out the back somewhere? This is typically one of the biggest hurdles I have seen for corporate knowledge. Yep, everybody. That's pretty unanimous. It's not the most effective. I think we've all been there where we're trying to find something, and number one, you've got to find where your little index is and then try and find the document, and then somebody hasn't put the document back. So yeah, it's not an effective way of managing old data. And much as some companies now are trying to get everything scanned so that things are text searchable through whatever document management system you use, it's not there. We're still not at the point where we can search old data. So we've already said that for data integration, if you can't see the data, it might as well not exist. The same is true of corporate knowledge. So if it's being stashed away in a box, up on a shelf somewhere, or hidden in a back room, or even worse, sent off-site to an archive facility, even if you've got the best indexing system in the world, the chances of you being able to actually use that data are slim at best. Even slimmer in an operational environment where you're needing to make decisions fairly rapidly, and you literally don't have time to sit there and go through all these boxes. So the next point I've kind of alluded to already, but obviously we live in a digital age and we all have pressures to do more with less. Taking that time to really talk to people has kind of fallen off the radar. Probably more so with COVID as well. There's an assumption that everything, if you need something, just Google it, or whatever your internal equivalent of that is. But like I said, in my field, and I'm sure in your disciplines as well, there really is a lot to learn from people outside of your discipline. So for me, talking to the guys and girls in exploration, learning more about how deposits have formed, what tectonic events have occurred through time, how things were in place. For me as a geotech, that gives me a lot of information about what I could potentially expect in terms of ground conditions. And that then feeds into trying to identify potential risk scenarios. And then from that, I can look at targeting drilling and things like that, instead of just going for a generic, we have 5 holes and we're going to put 3 in this lithology and 2 in that. So it can be tricky. It's not necessarily something that's easy, and definitely requires people skills, which is variable. Especially when you've got exploration officers separate to operations, which is something that you see a lot, and potentially a head office. So some of the larger companies, a lot of that information is actually stored somewhere, potentially even in a different state that's not easy to access. Different departments have different priorities. Things don't always align, that kind of thing. So we tend to revert to that digital data because it's easy, but potentially miss out on a whole heap of information from the team who know more about the deposit than Google could ever tell you. But what I've also found in my time is that exploration typically has the lowest personnel turnover on site. Now, I don't have any stats to back this up whatsoever, But just from what I've seen, the team in exploration are typically around for longer and have seen more of that deposit growth over time. So for me, they can be an invaluable resource to key into, as they do have those insights that otherwise you wouldn't find on Google. So last but not least is the geotech risk scenarios, which again I've already mentioned briefly. And they really come from understanding the deposit and identifying the risks that could exist. So instead of just making up possible scenarios, it's looking at the data that you have and trying to identify from that data what has the potential to happen. So for an example, if you think about a copper porphyry deposit, often the porphyries are surrounded by a zone of alteration and fracturing. It's a function of their intrusion into the host. And the mineralization is typically hosted in the porphyries. So there's already a heap of drilling normally for the porphyry. So you've got drill core, you've got photos, RQD. They're all typically collected on resource holes. So there's a fair chance that you can test any theories, hypotheses, risk scenarios around what might happen in that immediate area using existing data. So why go and spend more money on drilling when the information's already there? It might just not be in the format that you're expecting. Regional faulting is another good example. So often we know that they exist because they typically tend to offset mineralization. So for a mine that needs to develop through the offsets, understanding what those fault characteristics can have a significant implication on what ground support we need. If you're looking at a deep high stress mine, what the seismic potential looks like, and also where you're going to put your major infrastructure like crusher chambers, transfer stations, workshops, crib rooms, etc. Many a time I've been to a site and normally you've managed to find a major fault with a crusher chamber. So is there a way that we could have identified that structure before we actually started lots and lots of dollars worth of development, only to have to move it in the end? So again, you're going to have a heap of information already available from exploration, because understanding those offset structures is critical for them to define the ore body. So you may not have all the information that you need, but it definitely reduces the amount of additional data collection that you need to do to gather the information that you need. So the whole process of data collection is ultimately a really large-scale investigation that takes years, if not decades, to complete. And as long as we continue to compile that information, keep the data in a format that's accessible, and can be used by everybody, regardless of which department you work in, that picture is growing over time. So again, taking lessons from exploration, another change that we can make to geotech data collection is the development of the risk scenarios to then inform the data collection programs. So like I said before, not just saying, righto, we've got budget for 5 holes, we're going to put 2 here and 3 there because, you know, that's the dominant lithology and that's the next most dominant lithology. Actually strategically placing those drill holes based on the scenarios that we've already developed. We all know drilling costs money, and money is limited. Doesn't matter which company you work for, you just may have a bit more limited money than others. So again, back to exploration, there's a whole heap of tools that exploration use, like mag surveys, field mapping, geochem surveys, airborne surveys, other GFIs, that really look at that large-scale data. The resource models then developed and targets identified. These targets are then drilled, and that refinement process continues until you've got sufficient drilling to define that reserve, like we saw earlier in the workflow. That's typically not how we do it in geotech. Some places do. But typically, again, we're trying to get representative data from the main lithologies with minimal drill holes. Geotech is typically an added-on program. So whilst we might identify targets in terms of lithology, like I said, we average them out, we potentially miss key risk scenarios that are not established because they fall outside of that statistical analysis. So in terms of conclusions, there's obviously a lot that I've talked about today, but some of the key points, the current way of operating on a lot of sites is typically based on a legacy where there was a lot more people than we currently have. So the ability to go through your paper records, go back through mapping, go back through drill plots, those kind of things existed, whereas now we are a lot more time poor because we don't have the people. So if we don't change how we work, we will burn out people, and we have already seen this across the industry in recent years. And by burning people out and people leaving the industry, it increases the risks of adverse outcomes which lead to injury or worse, whether it be because we don't have the people to do the work, or those people aren't focused, or they're not in a good mental place, whatever that looks like. That is a legitimate risk that we are toying with at the minute. So there are solutions on the market to help us with some of the data challenges that we are facing. You do not need to start from scratch. I have seen a lot of companies decide that they need to take on these really large projects to design their own data management capture system. There is stuff out there. You don't have to go and do that. So it's not excluding some of the smaller companies from implementing some of these changes. From a geotech perspective, there are solutions in other disciplines. So the work that's being done with the JORC code, the way that resources, reserves are converted, there are systems in place across other disciplines that we can learn from. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. And there's also different ways to consider geotech risk and challenge some of the legacies in that space. Because we don't, just because something has always been done a certain way does not mean that that is the way it should still be done, particularly with the rate that we're seeing technology advance. So this was a quote that I wanted to leave everyone with, which I think you would have seen on LinkedIn. Essentially, what it's saying is that we need to minimize the number of unforeseen circumstances that are due to a lack of data and understanding, so that we can maximize the amount of control we've got on the hazard. So, like I said, this sums things up, sorry. And my question to you, and also a question for you to put to others around you, is how many unforeseen ground conditions, or more broadly, unforeseen risks, were actually not unforeseen at all, but a function of either a less than optimal investigation, data gathering, or interpretation. So instead of sitting in that reactionary rehabilitation space that we often find ourselves in the operation stage, which also impacts on operational safety and budgets, maybe there's more value in digging a little deeper into data collection, interpretation, and validation to stop some of these hazards from even developing in the first place, reduce the exposure risk of personnel working in the environments, and minimize later production delays and budget implications. So thank you for listening.